The morning arrived with a clarity that the previous day had lacked. The heavy mist that had clung to the western slope had been chased away by a brisk northern wind, leaving the air sharp and clean. Elder Julian stood at the edge of his work site, watching the first true rays of the sun strike the 2 courses he had laid the day before. The stone looked different in this light. The gray granite seemed deeper, and the dark basalt appeared almost blue. The foundation was settled and firm. It had survived its first night in the open air, and now it was ready to grow. Julian reached into his tool rack and pulled out the heavy steel hammer and the broad-faced chisel. These were the instruments of the 3rd course. While the first 2 layers were about the marriage of stone and earth, the 3rd course was about the marriage of stone and spirit. This was the layer where the wall would begin to show its face to the world. It required a level of precision that went beyond mere placement. The stones had to be dressed. Their wild and jagged edges had to be tamed so that the outer surface of the wall would be a smooth and continuous plane of strength. He selected a large block of limestone from the remaining pile. It was a sturdy piece, but it had a stubborn protrusion on its front face that would prevent it from sitting flush with the stones below. Julian knelt on the cold ground and placed the limestone on a bed of soft sand to steady it. He ran his hand over the rough surface, feeling the grain and the hidden fractures. He was looking for the point of least resistance. He placed the edge of the chisel against the offending bump of rock and adjusted the angle of the steel. He did not strike immediately. He waited until he felt the connection between the tool and the heart of the stone. When he finally brought the hammer down, the sound was a short and heavy report that echoed off the library walls above. There was no ringing note, only a dull and final vibration that traveled up through his arm and settled in his shoulder. A small flake of limestone sheared away and tumbled into the dust. Julian did not pause. He adjusted the chisel a fraction of an inch and struck again. He worked with a deliberate and rhythmic pace. Each blow was calculated to remove just enough material to reveal the flat face hidden within the raw rock. The dust began to rise in small and pale clouds, coating his dark forearms and settling in the fine hair of his wrists. He did not mind the grit. To Julian, the dust was a sign of progress. It was the physical evidence of the stone's transformation. He moved his hand over the newly revealed surface and felt the cool and slightly chalky texture. It was becoming smooth. It was becoming a part of the Abbey. He turned the stone over and began to work on the base, ensuring it was perfectly flat so it would not rock once placed on the bond below. The sun climbed higher, turning the sweat on Julian's brow into a salt-streaked map of his labor. He moved from stone to stone, treating each one with the same meticulous care. Some required only a single strike to find their true shape, while others were stubborn and required an hour of patient carving. He never lost his temper with the material. He knew that the stone had been formed over millions of years, and it would not be hurried by a man who had only a few decades of breath in him. He respected the time the mineral had taken to become itself, and in return the stone allowed him to guide its future. As he finished dressing each piece, he carried it to the wall. The weight was familiar and grounding. He lowered the 3rd course into place, feeling the way the newly carved faces aligned with the string line. The wall was rising. It was no longer just a foundation hidden in a trench. It was a presence. It stood nearly a foot high now, and the pattern of the different stones began to create a visual harmony. The dark basalt binders spanned the width of the structure, holding the inner and outer faces in a permanent embrace. Julian reached for his bag of shims and began the delicate process of leveling the course. He used tiny slivers of slate to compensate for the natural variations in the stone. He pushed them deep into the gaps with a small wooden probe, ensuring that every point of contact was solid. He was building for the wind and the rain and the slow movement of the mountain. He was building for the silence. He stopped for a moment to look down the length of the wall. The face was flush and true. It looked like a single living entity rather than a collection of separate rocks. He felt a deep sense of connection to the structure. He was pouring his own strength into the minerals, and in return the minerals were giving him a sense of permanence. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of the kitchens and the distant sound of the brothers in the garden. Julian remained in his circle of focus. He picked up his hammer once more and reached for the next stone. The rhythm of the work was a meditation, a long and slow conversation between the man and the mountain. He did not think about the end of the wall, or the years it would take to finish the restoration. He only thought about the next strike of the chisel and the next grain of the stone. The sun had reached a point in the sky where the shadows of the pine trees began to shrink toward their trunks. The western slope was bathed in a clear and unforgiving light that revealed every imperfection in the stone. Elder Julian stood before a specific boulder that had remained at the bottom of the pile since the beginning of the week. It was a massive erratic piece of ancient volcanic rock that had been carried here by a glacier long before the first monks had ever set foot on this mountain. It was dark and dense with a surface that looked like cooling lava frozen in time. Unlike the limestone or the granite, this stone did not have a clear grain. It was a singular and stubborn mass of mineral history, and it was too large to be moved into the wall as it was. Julian knelt in the dust and placed his hands on the rough surface. The stone was cold despite the midday sun. It seemed to pull the warmth directly from his palms as if it were hungry for the heat of the living. He did not move for several minutes. He was searching for the hidden heart of the boulder. He ran his fingers over the various ridges and pits looking for a line of weakness that only a mason could see. He found a faint discoloration, a slight streak of quartz that ran deep into the center of the mass. This was the path. This was where the stone would eventually yield, but it would not be an easy victory. He reached for his heavy iron bag and pulled out a set of feathers and wedges. These were simple tools, but they were the most powerful in his collection. He took a heavy steel drill and a short-handled hammer and began the process of the piercing. He placed the point of the drill against the quartz vein and struck the end with a deliberate and controlled force. The sound was a deep and resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire terrace. He did not swing with his whole arm. He moved from the wrist and the elbow, keeping his movements compact and efficient. After 20 strikes, he had created a small and perfect hole in the heart of the volcanic rock. He moved 6 inches down the line and began again. The repetition was a form of prayer. His breath became synchronized with the movement of the hammer. Strike and breathe. Strike and breathe. The dust from the drill was a fine and dark powder that coated his fingers and turned the skin of his forearms a deep shade of charcoal. He did not wipe it away. He allowed the grit to become a part of his grip. By the time he had drilled 5 holes across the face of the boulder, the sweat was carving channels through the dust on his forehead. He stopped to take a slow and measured drink of water from his skin. He did not rush. The stone had been here for millions of years, and a few more minutes of patience would not change the outcome. He took the steel feathers, which were too thin, and curved pieces of metal, and placed them into the first hole. Then he inserted the wedge between them. He repeated this for all 5 holes until the boulder looked as if it were wearing a crown of iron. Now came the moment of the gathering. Julian did not strike the wedges with his full strength. That would only bounce the steel or break the tool. Instead, he began to tap the top of each wedge in a steady and rhythmic sequence. He moved from left to right, and then back again. The sound was different now. It was higher and sharper, a metallic song that rang out across the valley. With each pass, the tension within the stone increased. He could feel it through the soles of his boots. The boulder was resisting. It was holding on to its unity with everything it had. Julian increased the weight of his strikes just a fraction. He was listening for a specific sound, a change in the pitch of the metal that would signal the beginning of the end. He was in no hurry. He watched a hawk circling high above in the blue void, and he felt the immense stillness of the mountain pressing in on him. He was a part of that stillness. He was the focus point of the pressure. On the 10th pass, the sound changed. It was no longer a ring, but a dull and heavy groan that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Julian stopped. He laid his hammer down and stood perfectly still. He did not need to strike again. He watched as a hairline fracture appeared at the first hole. It was thinner than a strand of hair, but it was moving. The crack traveled slowly along the quartz vein, jumping from hole to hole with a sound like a distant piece of ice breaking on a lake. The internal pressure of the volcanic rock was finally turning against itself. With a final and muffled sound, the boulder split in two. The two halves fell away from each other, revealing a center that had not seen the light of the sun for an eternity. The interior of the stone was a beautiful and iridescent black like the surface of a deep pond at midnight. It was smooth and glassed like a sharp contrast to the weathered and rough exterior. A faint and metallic smell rose from the newly exposed faces, a scent of ancient fires and the deep crust of the world. Julian reached out and touched the heart of the stone. It was surprisingly warm. The energy of the break had left a lingering heat in the mineral. He spent the next hour shaping the two halves into usable blocks. He used his smaller chisel to dress the edges and remove the jagged bits left by the split. He worked with a quiet and intense focus, his movements fluid and practiced. The volcanic stone was difficult to carve, but it was rewarding. Every piece that he removed was a victory of patience over resistance. By the time the sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, he had 2 perfect binders for the 4th course. These stones would be the anchors of the next layer, their density and weight providing the necessary stability for the library wall above. He carried the first of the new blocks to the wall. It was heavy enough that he felt the strain in his legs and the pull in his shoulders, but it was a good weight. He lowered the volcanic stone onto the bond of the 3rd course. It fit with a finality that made the air around it seem still. He reached for his shims and began the leveling process, once more his hands moving with a grace that masked the immense labor involved. The wall was now rising toward his waist. It was a physical manifestation of his days of effort, a structure of earth and stone and silent intention. Julian looked at his hands and saw the map of the work written in the dust and the fine lines of his palms. He felt the fatigue in his joints, but it was a quiet and satisfying tiredness. He looked at the split boulder, and then at the rising wall, and he felt the connection between the two. The mountain was being reshaped one stone at a time, and he was the one chosen to guide the change. He sat down on a nearby rock and watched the shadows begin to stretch across the terrace. The world was preparing for the evening, but the wall was standing firm, a new foundation for the ancient abbey. The sun moved across the vast and open sky with a slow and golden weight, and the heat began to draw the moisture from the very core of the stones. Elder Julian stood before the 4th course of the wall, and he felt the shift in the work. The foundation was buried and the base was solid, and now the wall was truly rising into the world of the air and the light. This was the stage where the internal structure became just as important as the external face. Julian turned away from the outer pile of boulders and looked at the smaller mounds of debris he had gathered over the weeks. This was the material for the hearting. He knelt in the grit and began to gather the small and jagged fragments of rock that most would have called waste. These were the broken bits of flint, and the shards of granite, and the smooth river pebbles that had no place on the visible surface of the wall. To a master mason, these were the secret strength of the structure. Julian took a handful of the sharp stones and began to drop them into the hollow center between the 2 outer faces of the wall. The sound was a bright and crystalline rattle, a chorus of mineral voices finding their places in the dark gaps. He did not simply toss them in. He placed them with the same care he had used for the massive binders of the previous courses. He used a heavy wooden rammer to pack the hearting down, and he felt the vibration of the impact travel through the handle and into the marrow of his bones. Every strike was a conversation with the gravity of the mountain. He was ensuring that there were no air pockets and no hidden voids where the frost could take root in the coming winter. The hearting had to be a single and unyielding mass that would press outward against the face stones and lock them into a permanent embrace. Julian worked in a steady and rhythmic circle, and his breath was a low and constant sound that matched the thud of the rammer. As he worked, he noticed a slight shift in the alignment of the limestone block on the northern corner. It was a minute movement, and a change of only a fraction of an inch, but to Julian it was as loud as a shout. He laid down the rammer and reached for his plumb line. This was a simple tool made of a heavy lead weight and a length of rough hemp cord. He held the end of the cord against the top edge of the wall and allowed the lead to dangle toward the earth. He was measuring the batter. A dry stone wall cannot be perfectly vertical, or it will eventually topple under its own weight. It must lean inward with a subtle and graceful slope so that every stone is constantly pressing toward the center. Julian watched the lead weight as it settled in the still air. He saw the way the cord bisected the shadow of the wall, and he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The lean was true. The the batter was following the ancient proportions that had been handed down through generations of builders at the Abbey. He reached for a small pinning stone and tapped it into a gap near the base of the limestone block. He watched as the stone adjusted itself, and the gap disappeared into the solid mass of the structure. The wall was not a static thing. It was alive and moving and constantly finding its own balance. The dust from the hearting was different from the dust of the dressing. It was darker and more fragrant, smelling of the deep earth and the ancient minerals of the trench. It settled into the fine lines of Julian's palms, and it turned his knuckles into a landscape of gray and charcoal. He looked at his hands, and he saw the history of the work written in the skin. He saw the small scars from the flint and the calluses from the granite, and he felt a deep sense of pride in the labor. He was not just building a wall. He was building a testament to the patience of the man and the permanence of the mountain. He moved to the center of the terrace and selected a through stone. This was a massive and long piece of gray slate that was intended to span the entire width of the wall from the outer face to the inner core. It was the bridge that would hold the two sides together. Julian braced his legs and lifted the slate, and he felt the immense strain in his thighs and his lower back. The weight was a physical presence that demanded everything he had to give. He walked slowly to the wall, and he guided the slate into position. It landed with a heavy and final sound that seemed to anchor the entire fourth course to the earth. He stood back and wiped the sweat from his neck with a damp cloth. The sun was now beginning its long descent, and the shadows of the library were stretching across the terrace like dark and protective wings. Julian looked at the progress of the day, and he saw the way the different stones were beginning to blend into a single and harmonious whole. The dark basalt and the gray limestone and the reddish sandstone were no longer separate entities. They were the wall. They were the foundation. They were the rooted strength of the Abbey. He took a small wooden trowel and began to smooth the surface of the hearting, ensuring that it was level and ready for the fifth course. He worked with a meticulous and quiet focus, and he felt the stillness of the mountain wrapping around him like a familiar garment. He was alone on the slope, but he did not feel the weight of the solitude. He felt the presence of the earth, and the memory of the builders who had come before him, and the promise of the stones that were yet to be laid. He was the mason, and the mountain was his master, and in the center of the work he found his peace. The wind shifted again, coming now from the high peaks, and carrying the scent of the coming rain. Julian looked up at the sky and saw the first thin clouds gathering on the horizon. He knew that the work would soon have to stop for the day, but he felt no urgency to finish. The wall would wait. The stones would remain. He reached for a final handful of small pebbles and dropped them into a gap in the center of the course. The sound was a soft and final click, and the ritual of the hearting was complete for the hour. The sun had begun to descend behind the highest peaks of the mountain, casting the western slope into a long and cooling shadow. The air was perfectly still, and the distant sounds of the Abbey had faded into a soft and rhythmic hum. Elder Julian stood before the fourth course of the wall, and he felt the transition from the physical labor of the day to the subtle art of the witnessing. This was the moment where he would check the spirit of the wall. A dry stone wall is not just a collection of rocks. It is a single and living entity that must vibrate with a unified voice. If one stone is loose or if one shim is poorly placed, the entire structure will carry a flaw that only the ears of a mason can detect. Julian reached into his tool rack and pulled out a small mallet made of aged and polished oak. It was a light and balanced tool, designed not for the heavy work of shaping but for the delicate task of listening. He knelt at the base of the northern corner, where the wall met the earth, and he placed his left hand flat against the surface of a large granite block. He felt the coldness of the mineral and the faint grit of the dust against his palm. He closed his eyes and allowed the rest of his senses to fade away until there was only the stone and the silence of the mountain. He began the ritual at the very bottom, tapping the oak mallet against the center of the first face stone. The sound was a deep and heavy thud, a resonance that felt as though it were coming from the heart of the mountain itself. It was a solid sound, a confirmation that the foundation was settled and firm. Julian moved his hand up to the second course, following the vibration through the layers of the masonry. He tapped the dark basalt binder, and the sound was higher and sharper, a crystalline ring that spoke of the density of the volcanic rock. He moved his mallet in a slow and steady rhythm, traveling the length of the wall like a musician tuning an immense and silent instrument. When he reached the center of the third course, he tapped a piece of gray limestone, and the sound changed. It was a hollow and rattling ring, a discordant note in the harmony of the structure. Julian stopped. He did not need to see the flaw to know it was there. He ran his fingers over the edges of the limestone, feeling for the tiny gap that his ears had discovered. He found a small pinning stone that had shifted during the packing of the harding. It was a minute error, a movement of only a few millimeters, but in the world of the mason it was a breach of the silence. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a thin sliver of slate. He moved with a quiet and deliberate focus, his hands dark against the pale gray of the limestone. He slid the slate into the gap behind the pinning stone, and he used the handle of his mallet to tap it home. He felt the resistance of the wall as the shim took hold and the weight of the course was redistributed. He tapped the limestone once more. The sound was now full and firm, a deep and resonant thud that matched the stones around it. The spirit of the wall was restored. The discord had been resolved. Julian continued the ritual, moving his mallet across the fourth course and into the corners of the structure. He was listening for the bond. He wanted to hear the way the stones interacted with one another, the way the weight of the binders pressed down on the layers below. He found a section where the granite and the sandstone met, and he spent a long time tapping the joints and feeling the vibrations in his fingertips. The wall was singing a song of stability and permanence. It was a heavy and grounding music, a sound that reinforced the rooted nature of the Abbey. The dust on his hands had turned into a fine and gray paste as the moisture of the evening began to settle on the terrace. He looked at his knuckles and his palms, and he saw the way the earth had reclaimed his skin. He was a part of the masonry. He was the bridge between the raw materials of the mountain and the finished structure of the wall. He felt a deep sense of connection to the stones, a feeling of mutual respect and understanding. He was not their master. He was their companion. He was the one who gave them a place to stand and a reason to be still. As he finished the ritual at the southern end of the terrace, the first star appeared in the darkening sky. Julian stood up and stretched his back, feeling the pull of the muscles in his shoulders and his thighs. The fatigue of the day was a warm and heavy presence, but it was accompanied by a profound sense of peace. He looked at the wall, and he saw more than just a barrier of rock. He saw a testament to the patience of the spirit. The wall was true. The spirit was solid. The foundation of the library was secure for another generation. He replaced the wooden mallet in his wrap, and he took a final look at the progress of the day. The four courses stood nearly as high as his waist, a dark and powerful ridge of earth and stone that looked as though it had always been a part of the slope. He could see the different textures of the rocks in the fading light, the rough grain of the granite and the smooth glass of the basalt and the chalky surface of the limestone. They were a unified whole, a single voice in the silence of the mountain. Julian sat down on his favorite observation rock, and he allowed the quietude to wrap around him. He did not think about the work of tomorrow or the weight of the stones that were yet to be moved. He only thought about the resonance of the wall and the way the earth felt beneath his feet. He was the mason of the western slope, and his heart was as steady as the granite at his back. The air was cooling rapidly, and the smell of the coming rain was growing stronger, but Julian remained in his seat. He was waiting for the final transformation of the day, the moment when the mountain would begin to breathe in the dampness of the night. The air on the western slope had changed from the dry and mineral heat of the afternoon to a heavy and electric stillness. The sky was no longer a vast and open blue, but a deep and bruised purple that seemed to press down on the peaks of the mountain. Elder Julian remained on his observation rock, his hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on the horizon where the clouds were gathered in thick and silent ranks. He felt the first stirrings of the wind, a cool and damp current that carried the scent of wet pine needles and distant lightning. It was the breath of the storm, a precursor to the cleansing that was about to begin. He watched the first drop of rain as it fell. It did not land on the earth or the grass, but on the dark and polished surface of the volcanic binder he had placed in the fourth course. The drop was large and heavy, and it shattered against the stone into 1,000 tiny jewels of moisture. Julian did not move. He watched as a second drop landed on the back of his hand, a cold and sudden sting against his dark skin. He felt the water as it traveled down the fine lines of his knuckles, washing away a small trail of the gray limestone dust. It was a sensory transition, a shift from the world of the dry and the solid to the world of the fluid and the cooling. Within moments, the steady patter of the rain began to fill the silence of the terrace. It was not a violent downpour but a rhythmic and gentle baptism of the mountain. Julian stood up slowly, his joints feeling the sudden drop in temperature. He did not feel the need to seek shelter immediately. He stood in the center of the workspace and allowed the rain to wash over him. He felt the moisture soaking into the heavy fabric of his robes, and the cooling sensation of the water on his scalp and his neck. He closed his eyes and turned his face toward the sky, breathing in the fresh and metallic scent of the petrichor. The rain was the final companion of the masonry, the element that would settle the dust and bind the spirit of the wall to the moisture of the earth. He turned his attention to the site, moving with a calm and deliberate pace. The rain was a gift, but it was also a force that required respect. He walked to the pile of sorted stones, and he began to cover them with a heavy canvas tarpaulin. He did not want the delicate limestone or the porous sandstone to become oversaturated before they were placed in the wall. He used several large river pebbles to weight the edges of the canvas, ensuring that the wind would not carry it away in the night. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands moving with the grace of a man who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. Next, he turned to his tools. He gathered the hammer and the chisels from the flat rock where they had been resting. The steel was already gleaming with a thin layer of moisture, and he knew that he would need to be thorough with the oiling later that evening. He placed the tools in their canvas wrap and he tucked the bundle into the deepest and most protected hollow of the rock. He checked the string line one last time, ensuring that the tension was still true despite the weight of the water. The line was a thin and dark silhouette against the gray of the masonry, a steady guide in the middle of the changing weather. Julian walked to the edge of the wall, and he watched the way the rain interacted with the masonry. The water did not sit on the surface of the stones but flowed into the gaps in the joints, disappearing into the hearting he had packed so carefully. This was the true test of the masonry. A well-built wall would allow the water to pass through without trapping it, preventing the internal pressure that could lead to a collapse. He saw the way the moisture darkened the colors of the rock, turning the gray granite into a deep charcoal and the reddish sandstone into a vibrant and earthy orange. The wall was beautiful in the rain, a living tapestry of the mountain's history. He knelt in the wet dirt, and he reached out to touch the fourth course. The stone was slick and cold, but it felt as solid as the mountain itself. He felt the weight of the rain as it pressed down on the structure, a natural force that the wall was designed to withstand. He felt a deep sense of connection to the storm. The rain was part of the cycle of the earth, the same cycle that had formed the minerals and the same cycle that would eventually return the wall to the soil. He was not a builder standing against nature. He was a builder working within it. The wind began to pick up, a low and rushing sound that moved through the pine trees like the tide of a distant ocean. The light was almost gone now, leaving the western slope in a state of soft and watery transition. Julian stood up and wiped the water from his eyes. He felt a deep and satisfied tiredness in his bones, the fatigue of a man who had met the challenges of the day and found his place in the order of the world. He was ready for the quietude of his cell and the steady pulse of the rest. He took a final look at the wall, a dark and powerful ridge in the middle of the falling rain. It was standing firm, a silent sentinel on the slope of the Abbey. He felt the peace of the mountain settling over his heart, a calm that was as deep and as unyielding as the granite at his feet. He turned away from the terrace and began the slow walk back toward the Abbey. His footsteps were silent on the wet grass, and the sound of the rain followed him like a familiar song. The day of the mason was over, and the night of the mountain had begun. The door of the cell was a heavy slab of seasoned oak that fit perfectly within the stone frame. When Elder Julian closed it, the sound of the storm was muffled and transformed into a deep and resonant vibration that seemed to travel through the very floor of the room. The interior of the cell was small and sparse, containing only a wooden stool and a straw pallet and a small shelf for a few modest belongings. The walls were made of the same gray granite he had spent the day shaping on the western slope. To any other man the room might have felt cold or confining, but to Julian it was a place of profound connection. He lived within the very material he mastered, and he felt the immense weight and stability of the Abbey pressing in on him with a protective and silent strength. He moved to the center of the room and began the slow process of removing his outer robe. The fabric was heavy and dark with the moisture of the mountain, and it clung to his shoulders with a cold and persistent weight. He pulled the garment over his head, and he felt the sudden release of the pressure and the cool movement of the air against his skin. His undershirt was also damp, but he did not rush to change it. He stood for a long moment in the center of the cell, and he allowed his body to adjust to the temperature of the stone. His skin was the color of the deep and fertile earth of the valley, and it gleamed in the dim light of the single candle that sat on the shelf. The fine lines of his muscles were etched with the fatigue of the masonry, and the grit of the limestone was still visible in the creases of his elbows and the webbing of his fingers. He took a dry linen cloth and began to wipe the moisture from his arms and his chest. The texture of the cloth was rough and invigorating, and it stimulated the circulation in his tired limbs. He worked with a quiet and rhythmic focus, following the same path he took when he was cleaning his tools. He dried his hands with a particular care, ensuring that every trace of the stone dust was removed from his palms. His hands were the primary instruments of his life, and he treated them with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. They were the bridge between the world of the spirit and the world of the rock, and they carried the history of every wall he had ever built. Once he was dry, he sat on the edge of the straw pallet, and he allowed his gaze to drift to the single window of the cell. It was a narrow opening cut deep into the granite, and it looked out toward the high peaks of the mountain. He could see the rain as it swept across the darkness in long and silver sheets, and he could hear the liquid cadence of the storm as it struck the exterior of the Abbey. The sound was a complex and beautiful tapestry of noise. There was the sharp and percussive impact of the drops against the stone walls, and the softer and more rhythmic drumming of the water on the slate roof above. There was the rushing sound of the wind as it moved through the narrow gaps, and the low and constant gurgle of the overflow from the stone gutters. Julian closed his eyes and allowed the sound to wash over him. He felt the resonance of the storm within the very marrow of his bones. To his trained ears the rain was telling him the story of the Abbey. He could hear the points where the masonry was solid and the points where the moisture was finding a way into the joints. He thought about the wall he had built that day, and he imagined the way the rain was interacting with the fourth course. He could feel the water flowing over the volcanic binders and settling into the hearting, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction in the integrity of the work. The wall was breathing. It was accepting the gift of the moisture, and it was holding firm against the weight of the night. The candle on the shelf flickered and cast long and dancing shadows across the granite walls. Julian watched the way the light played over the rough surface of the stone, and he saw the faces of the rocks he had laid years before. Every stone in his cell had a personality, and a history, and a specific place in the order of the building. He felt as though he were surrounded by old friends. The stones were silent, but they were not empty. They were filled with the memory of the earth, and the patience of the builders, and the steady pulse of the mountain. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life he had chosen. He was a man of the foundation, and he found his meaning in the slow and certain movement of the mineral world. The fatigue in his body was no longer a sharp and biting pain, but a warm and heavy blanket that seemed to pull him toward the earth. He felt the tension leading his shoulders, and the steady rhythm of his heart slowing to match the pace of the rain. He was not just listening to the storm, he was becoming a part of it. The boundary between the builder and the building was starting to dissolve. He was the stone, and he was the rain, and he was the silence of the Abbey. He reached out and touched the wall beside his bed, and he felt the immense and cooling presence of the granite. It was a solid and unyielding reality that gave him a sense of absolute security. He remained on the edge of the pallet for a long time, simply being present in the center of the quietude. He did not think about the work of the coming morning or the stones that were yet to be shaped. He only thought about the beauty of the rain and the strength of the foundation and the peace that comes from a day of honest labor. The world outside the cell was a place of movement and change, but here within the granite walls there was only the eternal and the still. He felt a deep sense of belonging. He was the mason of the western slope, and he was exactly where he was meant to be. The rain continued its steady and percussive dance, and the wind began to die down into a soft and sighing whisper. The candle burned low, and the shadows in the room grew deeper and more profound. Julian felt the first stirrings of the final rest. It was a slow and inevitable pull, a transition from the world of the senses to the world of the spirit. He adjusted his position, and he felt the straw of the pallet rustle beneath him with a sound like the dry grass of the mountain. He was ready to let go of the day. He was ready to find the stillness that lay at the heart of the stone. The candle on the small stone shelf had burned down to a mere nub of tallow, and the flame was a tiny and dancing point of amber light in the center of the deep shadows. Elder Julian watched the flicker with a steady and unblinking gaze, and he felt the immense stillness of the Abbey pressing in on him from every side. The room was no longer a separate space but a part of the mountain itself, and the granite walls seemed to vibrate with the low and rhythmic pulse of the earth. He felt the weight of the library above him and the depth of the foundation below, and he knew that the work he had done that day was a vital part of the whole. The wall was true, and the bond was solid, and the masonry was resting in the center of its own gravity. He moved his hand to the edge of the straw pallet, and he felt the rough and dry texture of the bedding. It was a simple and honest material, and it carried the scent of the summer fields and the high pastures. He adjusted his position, and the straw rustled with a sound like the movement of the wind through the dry stalks of the grain. He felt the tension leaving his lower back and the heaviness in his thighs, and he allowed his body to sink into the support of the pallet. His muscles were tired, but it was a quiet and satisfying fatigue that came from a day of meaningful labor. He was the mason, and his body was the instrument of the stone, and now the instrument was being returned to its case. The rain outside had settled into a constant and meditative drone, and the sound was a comfort to his spirit. He could hear the water as it traveled down the exterior of the granite walls, and he imagined the way the moisture was sealing the gaps in the fourth course of the wall. The rain was a binder of its own, a liquid element that connected the minerals of the rock to the minerals of the soil. Julian felt a deep sense of peace in the knowledge that the mountain was taking over the work. The wall was no longer his alone. It was now a part of the natural order, and it would stand firm against the storms of the coming century. He breathed in the cool and damp air of the cell, and he felt the freshness of the rain filling his lungs and calming his heart. He looked up at the ceiling where the shadows were moving in a slow and hypnotic dance. The light of the candle was fading, and the darkness was beginning to reclaim the corners of the room. He did not feel the need for light. He knew every inch of the cell by touch, and he felt the presence of the stones even in the absence of the sun. The granite was a silent and unyielding companion, and it gave him a sense of absolute security. He felt as though he were lying in the very heart of the mountain, protected by miles of earth and the ancient wisdom of the builders. He was rooted, and he was safe, and he was exactly where he belonged. His thoughts began to drift like the mist in the valley below the western slope. He saw the faces of the stones he had shaped that day, and he felt the tactile memory of the hammer and the chisel in his palms. He saw the dark basalt and the gray limestone and the reddish sandstone, and he felt the beauty of their intersection. He thought about Brother Elias in the garden and Master Silas in the woodshop, and he felt the connection between their labors. They were all part of the same ritual, and they were all working toward the same goal of peace and restoration. The Abbey was a living entity, and every act of creation was a prayer for the stillness of the world. The darkness in the cell was now almost complete, and the only sound was the steady and percussive rhythm of the rain. Julian felt his heartbeat slowing to match the cadence of the storm, and his breath becoming a low and constant whisper in the quietude. The boundary between his body and the pallet and the stone wall was starting to disappear. He was becoming a part of the architecture of the night. He felt the immense and grounding power of the earth pulling him down into a state of deep and restorative rest. There was no more need for action and no more need for thought. The work was done, and the foundation was set, and the mason was ready to find his own silence. He pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders, and he felt the warmth of the fabric spreading through his limbs. The wool was thick and coarse, and it smelled of the high sheep folds and the natural oils of the flock. It was a comforting and familiar scent, and it added another layer to the sensory tapestry of the room. Julian closed his eyes and he felt the weight of his eyelids as a final and welcome pressure. The darkness behind his eyes was a vast and open space where the images of the day began to dissolve into the formless peace of the night. He was the mason of the mountain's bone, and he was resting in the center of his own creation. The rain continued to fall in a steady and melodic song, and the wind moved around the corners of the abbey with a soft and sighing breath. The mountain was at peace, and the stones were still, and the foundation was secure. Julian felt a profound sense of gratitude for the stillness, and the weight, and the silence. He was a part of the earth, and the earth was a part of him, and in the middle of the storm he found the ultimate quietude. The fatigue of the day was a warm and heavy sea that was now carrying him away from the shores of the world. He was drifting into the deep and ancient rest of the mineral kingdom. He adjusted his head on the pallet, and he felt the last of the tension leaving his neck and his jaw. He was completely still, and his mind was a clear and empty space. There was only the sound of the rain, and the feel of the wool, and the presence of the granite. The world outside the abbey was a distant and forgotten memory, and the only reality was the peace of the cell. He was the mason, and he was the stone, and he was the foundation. He was the rooted strength of the western slope, and he was finally letting go of the day. The candle flickered one last time, and then the flame went out, leaving the room in a state of absolute and velvet darkness. Julian did not move. He did not need to see the world to know that it was true. He felt the immense and silent power of the mountain wrapping around him like a familiar garment, and he allowed himself to sink into the final and deepest layer of the quietude. The ritual of the masonry was complete, and the ritual of the rest was beginning. He was a man of the earth, and he was returning to the earth in the center of the night. And in that quietude he slept.